The Riftwar Saga by Raymond Feist was published between 1982 and 1986, and I feel is one of the best works of an era of fantasy that, frankly, I think is often forgotten and certainly not talked about that often on BookTube today. So today I'm just going to give you some reasons why I think you would enjoy The Riftwar Saga by Raymond Feist. So this will be a spoiler-free discussion. I'm just going to simply talk about the components of this series that I think make it great and reasons why you may enjoy it. So first of all, I just want to talk about one aspect of this series which is often confusing, and that is the first book. Magician is a single-volume book by Feist, published in 1982, but the American publisher split it into two different paperbacks. These were the two paperbacks that I read in the 80s, Magician Apprentice and Magician Master. And when I did this reread this year, I reread Magician as the single volume, which is my preferred way to read it. I think it makes the first book a lot more epic in scope in that way, but you can read it certainly in any of these manners. This makes the books a lot more even and doesn't have just a really, really thick first book and shorter second and third books. But however you read it, you can read it as a 4-volume quartet or as a trilogy consisting of Magician, Silverthorn, and A Darkness at Sethenon. So I have kind of 5 reasons here that I'm going to talk about just as my talking points as to why I think you should read the Riftwar Saga. Point number 1 is it's familiar until it isn't. And you can say this about much of the fantasy in the 80s and early 90s. Publishers wanted to find that next Tolkien. Because those paperbacks of The Lord of the Rings were such great sellers, they were trying to find the next thing. So in the late 70s, all through the 80s, even in the early 90s, publishers really weren't publishing a whole lot outside of that vein. So if you're going to get published as an author, you had to kind of walk that road before you kind of went your own direction. And that's what Feist does here. But he did it a lot quicker than a lot of other authors that are notable from this time. Terry Brooks, his first book, the bestseller, The Sword of Shannara, was very much a Tolkien clone. But in his second book, you see he started to go another path. Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman of Dragonlance fame, they didn't go their own path until really the second trilogy. The first trilogy is very much a D&D campaign based off of Middle-earth. How about David Eddings, one of my favorites? I have an Eddings shelf over here. Eddings never strayed from the Tolkien formula. He wrote an entire series which was like Tolkien, and then he wrote another entire series which was the same as the first series. So he never strayed at all. Feist, early in the first book, you start to see how he's going to go a very different direction. Namely, the thing that he incorporates as my second point is kind of some sci-fi elements into his fantasy. Because in this first book, it's the Riftwar Saga. It's not a spoiler to say that there's a rift, and the rift is between worlds. It's a tear in space-time where we have these two different worlds that become at war with one another. And just conceptually alone, that was very different. And in the first book, in Magician, we do get to see one of the characters spend a good amount of time on that world. So we get to explore the culture, and we get kind of these dual worlds at war with one another. That is something that is very different from what Tolkien and Eddings and all of those other authors did. So it was familiar, and then it went a different direction. And these sci-fi elements in just the Rift were very interesting to me. Additionally, the magic, as it progresses through the series, I would never say this is a hard magic system. I don't think they had that term until maybe 10, 15 years ago. So that wasn't a thing in the 80s, but there's a little bit more explanation behind that magic system than a lot of the magic systems in the 80s. So it's still a soft magic system, but especially in the third book, you kind of see some cosmic forces of it. There's some kind of quasi-time travel elements in there. And you see just, it's a lot different from what the traditional fantasy tales were basically telling at the time in the 1980s. So those two things right away make it very different. Third point, one of my favorite words, Bildungsroman. And I don't even know if I ever say it right. The coming of age tale. This starts off, just like my first point, this starts off a lot like you would think. Coming of age tale. We have our orphan farm boy, because we're in a rural duchy in this world of Cry-D, and we have this orphan named Pug And we're about to see all of the children at this time are about to be apprenticed. And you see that, of course, by the title, you can see that Pug is going to be the magician apprentice. So you assume right away, because you meet Pug, that this is going to be his coming of age story. We're going to follow Pug, and he's going to go on the hero's journey. And by the last book, he's going to be the big hero. Well, part of that's true. And it's done very, very well. But there are actually 3 Bildungsroman stories going on at the same time. We have Pug, the would-be magician, we have Tomas, the would-be soldier, and Prince Arutha, the would-be ruler. And we get to follow all 3 of these characters through the scope of the series. And it's a long coming-of-age tale. It takes place over a span of about 12 years from the beginning of Magician to the end of A Darkness at Sethanon. And one thing that Feist does really, really well, not just between the books in this series, but within the books, he is a master of the time jump. In fact, that he will jump months or even years ahead, but he always catches you up in a way that it doesn't feel like an exposition dump like a lot of other authors might employ. It always feels like you've lived through those months or years that you just didn't witness on the page, but you know exactly what was going on. He's really good at that. But we get to see this coming-of-age tale for these 3 great, great characters over a span of 12 years. They are basically adolescent boys at the beginning, and they are men at the end. And it's a really great journey when you think about where it started, when you get to the end and you see where these 3 characters have gone and their importance to the entire world they've become. Point number 4, each book tells a great story. I don't know when it became the thing that a trilogy was basically a first book, and then the last 2 books were just one story where the middle book became this setup for the 3rd book. Or even when a trilogy just became one story split into 3 parts. Maybe because of Tolkien, that's where it started. I don't know. But I love about the Riftwar saga, if you read them as a trilogy as I did, you get one story, which is Magician. You get a different story, Silverthorn, and a different story of A Darkness at Sethanon. In fact, the big bad of the entire series is only kind of alluded to in the 1st book, is just kind of the B story in the 2nd book, and of course is the main story in the 3rd book. So it's great that Feist gives you 3 very different stories. Magician is kind of the bulk of the coming of age of the 3 characters. Silverthorn is a grand quest, and A Darkness at Sethanon is the final battle, the good versus evil, as well as the cosmic elements and the magical elements that have been permeating the entire series. So I love the fact that all 3 of these books stand very, very well alone. Now, you couldn't read them independently. It wouldn't make sense. You wouldn't know the characters or anything like that. But each book has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And then each book starts anew. And it's so great. I wish more authors would write trilogies like this, because it feels like 3 independent books that are connected rather than, oh, it's just one book and we're going to chop it into 3 because publishers like to publish trilogies. All right, my 5th and final point. As kind of an older booktuber here, there was great fantasy before the 1990s. And I feel so often that only modern fantasy gets talked about, except for a few exceptions, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, that's about it. There was great fantasy before The Wheel of Time, which is kind of the starting point, I think, of a lot of people that talk about it and people read the fantasy genre. It's a much different era. I know part of it for me is nostalgia. However, when I look at all of the books that I read in the 80s, all of the fantasy series, because I've revisited just about all of them, Dragonlance, Terry Brooks, David Eddings, to name kind of my top 3, Feist's world is the one that I want to explore the most. So I have plans over the next few years to potentially read all of the Riftwar cycle, which is about 30 books, separated into a bunch of sub-series, so it makes it easy to read and one series and stop and then pick up the next one later. His world is the one that I feel most compelled to continue reading. Of all of those greats that I still love to this day, despite the derivative nature and the formulaic kind of storytelling, I really want to read more Feist, and I hope that you do too. I will be reading the Empire trilogy set in this world. It's an independent trilogy that doesn't really correspond to the entire scope of the Riftwar cycle, so it could be read 100% independently. So even if you haven't read the Riftwar, if you want to read the Empire trilogy that Raymond E. Feist wrote with Jenny Wirtz, I'm going to be starting that in July. Over on Alan's channel, The Library of Alexandria, he's doing a read-along of that series, one book per month, July, August, September. So you can join us and read that. I've heard so many great things about this trilogy. I've heard that, in fact, this might be the best of all of Feist's works. So I'm looking forward to reading that. Hey, if you have read the Riftwar cycle, I tried to keep this list to 5, but I had a lot more I could have talked about. Like, let me give you just a quick number 6. There's a battle sequence in the first book, which is one of the most memorable battle sequences I've read anywhere. That includes Bernard Cornwell, Sanderson, Jordan, all the greats that write battle sequences. Feist has one where the tactics are just amazing. That could be number 6. So any of you that have read the Riftwar saga, what would you add to tell people to read this series more? And I would love if any of you, after watching this video, decide to read the Riftwar saga, stop back after you read it and let me know what you thought. All of these videos, if I get one person to read a book that I love or a book series that I love, it's worth the time that I spent shooting it and editing it. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter and Goodreads. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.